The chandeliers of Lady Harbury's ballroom burned like captured constellations above the polished marble floor, scattering gold across silk sleeves and jeweled throats, while London's most exacting society moved in elegant circles beneath their glow. Music rose in confident spirals from the string quartet upon the dais, its rhythm measured and assured, as though the season itself possessed a heartbeat that evening and intended to be admired. Miss Eleanor Whitcombe stood very still beside a pillar carved with climbing roses, her gloved hands folded carefully before her as if she feared even the smallest gesture might disturb the delicate balance she had fought all evening to maintain. She had chosen her gown with deliberate restraint, selecting lavender instead of white, simplicity instead of ornament, modest dignity instead of invitation. It had not protected her. Across the ballroom, young ladies leaned together beneath the fluttering shelter of painted fans, their whispers drifting like perfumed smoke through the air, sometimes soft enough to ignore, sometimes sharp enough to wound. Eleanor had learned long ago to recognize which variety approached her direction before the words themselves arrived. Tonight they arrived clearly. "She does try," one voice murmured, not quietly enough to be kind. "Yes," replied another with a sigh that carried amusement rather than sympathy, "but effort cannot improve what nature neglected." A third voice laughed. "If the season must crown an unfortunate specimen, surely Miss Whitcombe stands unrivaled." The laughter that followed was light, musical, and merciless. Eleanor did not move. She did not lower her head. She did not allow the careful calm upon her face to falter. Years of such moments had taught her the discipline required to remain untouched in appearance, even when the words struck like sleet against bare skin. Only her fingers tightened slightly against each other inside their pale gloves. Nearby couples turned slowly in the waltz, skirts whispering across polished stone, their smiles untouched by cruelty because they had never needed to defend themselves against it. Eleanor watched them with quiet attentiveness, as though studying a distant country she might never enter. Her mother stood across the room speaking anxiously with a distant cousin, her posture rigid with hope that some gentleman might yet request a dance before the evening ended. Eleanor understood the silent plea in that posture. She understood it too well. No gentleman approached. She had attended 3 assemblies already that season, and not once had her dance card filled beyond a single polite obligation offered by a family acquaintance too elderly to fear gossip. Tonight appeared determined to follow the same pattern. A young officer passed near her position and glanced in her direction with visible hesitation, as though some instinct had briefly urged him forward before another instinct corrected the error. He bowed politely instead to a brighter girl at her shoulder and led that fortunate companion immediately toward the dance floor. Eleanor inclined her head to him in acknowledgment of a courtesy never offered. She did not blame him. Society taught its sons early which choices promised admiration and which promised ridicule. A servant approached with a tray of champagne glasses that trembled faintly beneath the weight of his responsibility, and Eleanor accepted one with quiet gratitude, if only to give her hands occupation. The cool stem steadied her breathing, though she did not drink. She had promised herself she would remain 1 hour. That hour had nearly passed. She began to consider whether departure might be managed without attracting attention when another ripple of laughter rose nearby, louder this time, careless enough to spread across the marble space between conversation circles like a thrown stone across still water. "There she stands again," a young lady observed with cheerful cruelty. "The poor creature never learns. Perhaps she hopes persistence will persuade Providence to reconsider its decision," another replied. "Or perhaps," came a third voice brighter and sharper than the rest, "she believes some desperate gentleman will mistake her for an heiress in dim candlelight." The laughter that followed carried farther than intended. Heads turned. Eleanor felt their attention settle upon her like winter frost. Still she remained upright. Still she held her glass. Still she allowed no visible retreat. Yet something fragile within her composure shifted then, not broken but strained, as though a thread long stretched had drawn suddenly tighter than it was meant to endure. She inclined her head once more, neither in surrender nor apology, but in acknowledgment that she had heard what society wished her to hear. It was at that moment that the music faltered. Only slightly. Only for an instant. Yet the interruption moved through the ballroom like a change in weather. Near the marble columns at the far edge of the chamber stood His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshire, whose presence alone altered the gravity of any room he entered. He had arrived late, as was his custom, and had spoken little since crossing the threshold, though many eyes had followed him with careful curiosity. He did not dance. He did not linger. He did not concern himself with the minor dramas of drawing-room cruelty. Until now. Eleanor did not immediately notice him watching her. Few women ever did at first. The Duke's gaze possessed the stillness of winter fields beneath moonlight, calm enough to escape attention until one realized how completely it observed. He had heard the laughter. He had seen her remain standing. He had seen her refuse to retreat. The string quartet resumed its melody uncertainly, as though uncertain whether the evening intended to continue as before. Eleanor lowered her untouched glass onto a passing tray and prepared quietly to withdraw toward the terrace doors, believing departure the only dignity still available to her. She had taken no more than 3 measured steps when a movement beside her interrupted that intention. The crowd parted without understanding why. Conversation softened without invitation. Even the music seemed to lean aside. His Grace stopped directly before her. He bowed. Not politely. Not briefly. But with unmistakable intention. Every voice within the ballroom fell silent as though commanded by some invisible authority older than etiquette itself, and Eleanor felt the weight of 100 astonished gazes gather around them like tightening rings of light. When he straightened, his expression remained composed, his voice low, and his words carried clearly enough for all who listened to hear. Then she will be my Countess. Morning arrived in London not with sunlight alone but with rumor, and before the bells of St. James's had finished their measured ringing, the declaration spoken beneath Lady Harbury's chandeliers had already begun its strange journey through drawing-rooms, breakfast parlors, and carriage interiors where astonishment traveled faster than horses ever could. Servants carried fragments of it between silver trays and teacups, governesses repeated it in cautious undertones while arranging copybooks, and ladies who had laughed the night before now rehearsed their surprise with careful expressions before their mirrors. At the modest Whitcombe townhouse in Brook Street, Eleanor descended the narrow staircase shortly after 10 with the quiet composure of one determined to meet whatever awaited her without indulgence in dread, though she could not entirely silence the echo of the Duke's voice as it had sounded across the ballroom like a bell struck once and never answered. Her mother waited in the morning room beside the window, one trembling hand resting upon a folded note as though she feared it might otherwise vanish. "My dear," she whispered, rising too quickly, "a delivery has arrived." Upon the small table beside the hearth stood a porcelain vase Eleanor did not recognize, and within it rested a single arrangement of white winter roses so fresh their petals still carried beads of cold from the journey. They were not lavishly displayed nor arranged for spectacle, but chosen with an elegance so deliberate that their simplicity seemed almost ceremonial. No card accompanied them. Eleanor did not touch them immediately. Instead she studied their stillness, their pale confidence, and the impossible calm with which they occupied her mother's modest morning room as though they belonged there by right rather than intrusion. Her mother pressed the folded note into her hands. It contained only a single line. "My intention was not spoken lightly." No signature followed, yet none was required. Eleanor felt the quiet center of her composure shift, not broken but unsettled, like water touched by a stone whose depth could not yet be measured. Before she could decide whether gratitude or caution should guide her response, the sound of carriage wheels halted outside their door with a precision too deliberate to be mistaken for accident. Their servant entered moments later, visibly uncertain how to deliver the announcement with proper dignity. "Your Grace's carriage awaits Miss Whitcombe," he said carefully, as though repeating words he did not quite believe. Her mother's hand tightened upon the arm of her chair. Eleanor rose. She did not hurry, though her pulse betrayed her. Outside, the Raven's higher crest shone darkly against the carriage panel, unmistakable even to passers-by who paused in open curiosity along the pavement. The footman opened the door without flourish. Inside no companion waited. Only a sealed envelope rested upon the opposite seat. She opened it as the carriage began to move. "Hyde Park," the note read. "If the morning permits your confidence." No command accompanied the invitation. No explanation followed it. Yet the carriage did not turn aside from its destination. They passed beneath the pale branches that bordered the park's winter paths, where riders slowed discreetly to observe her arrival and walkers pretended not to stare while whispering to companions whose curiosity proved stronger than discretion. When the carriage stopped beside the Serpentine, the Duke already stood waiting near the railing, his posture composed enough to appear accidental to any observer determined to misunderstand him. He bowed as she approached, not deeply enough to invite spectacle, yet not carelessly enough to suggest indifference. "Miss Whitcombe," he said, his voice low but steady, "I feared the roses might require explanation." "They required courage," she answered softly. His expression altered, though only slightly. "I hope they required neither defense nor apology." They walked beside the water together, not touching, yet not separated by the careful distance society usually insisted upon between strangers whose reputations remained unlinked. Several riders slowed again. One gentleman removed his hat with visible uncertainty. Another failed to disguise his astonishment entirely. Eleanor felt their attention settle upon her shoulders like invisible lace too heavy to ignore. "You understand what London believes," she said at last. "I understand what London invents," he replied. "And you permit it?" "I permit nothing," he answered calmly. "I choose." His certainty unsettled her more than rumor itself. When he returned her to Brook Street, the same stillness accompanied their parting, though now it felt less like distance and more like restraint deliberately chosen rather than imposed. By afternoon the story had doubled in size. By evening it had tripled. By Sunday it had entered the sanctuary of St. George's with them both. As Eleanor guided her mother toward their pew after the service concluded, she became aware of a subtle movement near the aisle, and before she could retreat politely aside, the Duke stepped forward and bowed not to her alone but to her mother with unmistakable respect. Gasps followed the gesture like startled birds. Her mother returned the bow with trembling dignity. The Duke spoke only one sentence. "I trust you enjoyed the roses, madam?" Then he departed without waiting for acknowledgement. Eleanor remained still long after he had gone. For the first time she understood that his attention was neither accidental nor theatrical. It was deliberate. And deliberate attention from a duke could not remain private. 2 evenings later a formal invitation arrived sealed in crimson wax bearing the Ravenshire crest, requesting the presence of Miss Whitcombe and her mother at a small musical evening in his London residence, and before Eleanor had decided whether courage or prudence demanded refusal, a second message followed immediately behind the first. It bore not his seal. It bore the royal cipher. Her mother unfolded it with hands that trembled so visibly Eleanor was forced to steady the page herself before the words could be read aloud. "Her Majesty requests the opportunity," the letter declared, "to observe Miss Whitcombe at the forthcoming reception." The royal reception unfolded beneath ceilings painted with pale clouds and triumphal allegories that seemed to watch the assembled nobility with distant patience, while polished floors reflected the glow of hundreds of candles arranged so precisely that even shadows appeared disciplined by ceremony. Eleanor Whitcombe entered upon her mother's arm with a composure she had practiced carefully in the carriage, though she felt every step as distinctly as if she crossed a narrow bridge suspended above judgment itself. Conversation shifted the moment her name was announced. Not loudly, not rudely, but unmistakably. Faces turned with that subtle alertness peculiar to courts where curiosity wore manners like gloves, and Eleanor understood at once that she had not been invited merely as a guest but as an object of quiet inspection whose presence required explanation. She did not search for him immediately. Yet she felt the certainty of his nearness before she saw him. The Duke of Ravenshire stood near one of the tall mirrored panels that reflected both candlelight and expectation, his expression composed as ever, though his attention rested upon her with a steadiness that neither concealed itself nor demanded acknowledgement. He crossed the distance between them without haste. "Miss Whitcombe," he said, bowing with that deliberate gravity which had already begun to unsettle London more thoroughly than scandal itself. "Your Grace," she answered, her voice calm though the room seemed suddenly smaller around them. "You honor this evening by attending. I believe the honor was not mine to refuse." A faint change touched his expression then, as though her words had revealed something he had not intended to ask. "You owe this court nothing," he said quietly. "I owe my mother peace," she replied. He did not answer at once. Instead he offered his arm. Not ceremoniously, not theatrically, but with the simple certainty of a man who had already decided his place beside her required no permission from observers. They crossed the reception chamber together beneath 1,000 attentive glances that followed them like drifting lanterns across dark water, and Eleanor felt each step alter the shape of her courage in ways she had never imagined possible. A group of ladies paused mid-conversation as she passed. One lowered her fan too slowly. Another forgot to complete a curtsy. None spoke. Their silence carried more weight than laughter ever had. At the far end of the chamber the Queen stood surrounded by courtiers whose careful arrangement resembled a living frame around authority itself, and when Eleanor approached within the permitted distance she lowered herself into the deepest curtsy she had ever performed without losing balance or breath. The Queen regarded her longer than etiquette required. "You are Miss Whitcombe," Her Majesty observed at last. "Yes, ma'am." "And London speaks of you with unusual persistence." "So I am told, ma'am." A faint smile touched the royal mouth, though it revealed nothing of approval or displeasure. "Persistence is rarely accidental." "No, ma'am." "And His Grace speaks of you not at all." Eleanor hesitated only a moment. "Perhaps, ma'am, he prefers actions to explanations." A ripple of restrained amusement passed through the surrounding courtiers. The queen inclined her head once. That preference has served him before. The audience ended there, though the impression it left behind lingered like a fragrance no one wished to name aloud. As Eleanor withdrew beside the Duke once more, she became aware that the nature of the evening had altered subtly but unmistakably. She was no longer merely observed. She was considered. They passed into a quieter gallery where tall windows admitted the silver light of a late spring rain, and the distant music from the reception chamber softened into something gentler, almost private in its distance. "You answered well," he said. "I answered honestly. I did not expect less." His certainty unsettled her more than praise might have done. "Your Grace," she said at last, stopping beside one of the tall windows where raindrops traced uncertain paths through candlelight reflections, "London believes I understand something I do not." He regarded her steadily. "And what does London believe?" "That you intend to marry me." "I do." The simplicity of the answer struck her more deeply than any elaborate declaration could have done. She drew a careful breath. "Then I must ask why." For the first time since she had known him, silence lingered between them, not as composure but as decision. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Voices drifted faintly beyond the gallery doors. At last he spoke. "Years ago," he said quietly, "before my brother died, before the title altered my obligations, I returned from the peninsula ill enough to be forgotten beside a roadside chapel beyond Surrey." She did not move. "No one stopped," he continued. "No one asked whether I required assistance." The memory had not softened with time. She could hear it in his voice. "Except one person," he said. A faint tremor moved through her certainty then, not yet recognition, but something near it. "She carried bread in a wicker basket," he continued. "She believed I was merely a stranger who required water." Eleanor's breath caught before she understood why. "She remained beside me until morning," he said. "She read aloud when I could not sleep." The gallery seemed suddenly smaller. The rain louder. "And she never asked my name," he finished. Eleanor felt the memory rise before she could stop it. A roadside chapel. A soldier scarcely conscious. A night she had never mentioned because it had seemed too ordinary to matter. "You," he said gently, "were that girl." For a moment she could not speak. The reception chamber's distant music returned like something remembered from another life. "I thought," she whispered at last, "you never saw my face." "I did not," he answered. "But I heard your voice." His gaze did not waver. "And I have been listening for it ever since." The days that followed the revelation of the roadside chapel seemed to Eleanor Whitcombe as though London itself had shifted beneath her feet. Each step upon the polished pavements felt heavier, weighted by the knowledge that the Duke of Ravenshire had observed her soul long before society had noticed her presence. Yet the revelation brought neither relief nor ease. It brought expectation, and expectation bore a weight of its own, heavier than scandal, heavier than whispered ridicule. She remained cautious, deliberate in every gesture, and every smile carefully measured as she moved among the drawing rooms and garden paths that had once been her sanctuary. The world expected her to act as though nothing had changed, yet every glance, every bow from acquaintances now carried a new intensity. Some whispered, wondering whether she had captured the Duke's imagination, while others murmured behind screens of polite civility, calculating what advantage could be found in her sudden prominence. The Duke himself remained equally composed, appearing only when necessary, attending assemblies and musical evenings, but never offering explanations that might reduce his deliberate mystery. Eleanor understood the subtlety of his strategy. London must believe he chose her not for memory, not for sentiment, but because of some inscrutable necessity. Yet she knew otherwise. She had glimpsed the truth in the quiet firmness of his gaze beside the gallery window, the night the rain had drawn silver lines upon the glass, the night when words had been fewer than the meaning behind them. The tension became unbearable one late afternoon when a letter arrived from Ravenshire House, sealed with crimson wax. The note contained a simple request, that she visit the Duke at his countryside estate for a private discussion, one that would require neither ceremony nor audience. Eleanor hesitated, aware that to accept was to place herself entirely in his power, yet she felt a stirring curiosity that outweighed fear. She could not ignore the pull, that unspoken thread connecting their fates. When she arrived at Ravenshire House, the familiar grandeur of the estate seemed less imposing than the quiet strength of the Duke himself. He received her in the great conservatory, where sunlight fell through latticed windows and touched the leaves of orange trees that filled the room with a delicate fragrance. For a moment, Eleanor considered retreating, overwhelmed by both the opulence surrounding her and the weight of the history between them. "You came," he observed simply, his eyes measuring her without intrusion. "I did," she said, her voice steady though her pulse betrayed her. "Because you asked and because I wished to understand." He gestured toward a pair of high-backed chairs near the fountain, where water shimmered in light and sound together, creating a private rhythm that seemed to separate the world beyond the conservatory doors. She seated herself deliberately, hands folded upon her lap, and watched him in return. "You understand," he began, "that society will not grant us patience. They will not allow hesitation or doubt. They believe all is a spectacle, all a wager, all a scandal." "I understand," she replied, "but I cannot act as if their whispers guide me. I have lived too long under their judgment to surrender now to any choice not my own." The Duke studied her, the faintest crease forming between his brows, a sign he allowed only in private moments. "And yet," he said, voice low and deliberate, "you remain here." "Because I must," she answered. "Understand why it is you wish me as companion, as countess, as witness to your life, if only for a portion of it." He considered her words, the silence stretching between them, heavy with expectation and longing, until he stood and moved closer, so close that the scent of leather and parchment and faint cedar filled her senses. "I have never been able to forget," he said finally, "the courage you showed when you believed no one observed. I have never ceased to admire the steadiness of your heart, the clarity of your mind, the dignity you maintained when all else threatened to overwhelm you." Eleanor's breath caught. "You are too generous," she whispered. "Or perhaps the world is cruel." "Neither," he said. "I am simply aware at last of the truth. You were never as the world believed, Miss Whitcombe. You were always more." The confession hung in the room between them, delicate as the petals of a rose brushed by sunlight. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, not with fear but with recognition. She was being offered not pity, not protection, but understanding. She had expected scandal, spectacle, whispers, and yet here, in the quiet of the conservatory, she received the gift of his attention undiluted by judgment. Yet even in this intimacy, hesitation remained. "Then why," she asked softly, "do you speak to me of admiration while the world expects a wager, a marriage, a spectacle?" "Because," he replied, "I would have nothing that is less than genuine. If you are to stand beside me, it must be of your own accord, free from society's expectations, free from my position, free from all else but choice." For the first time, Eleanor considered the weight of her own desires, her own fear, and the life that awaited her should she accept. The conservatory felt like the threshold of a different world, one that existed beyond London's gossip, beyond judgment, beyond her careful restraint. She had been shaped by humiliation, by quiet observation, by whispers that once seemed unbearable, and now she realized that the same world which had scorned her had also brought her here, to the presence of a man who saw her, truly, entirely. "I cannot speak lightly," she said at last, voice steady though trembling beneath the surface. "I cannot promise what my heart has yet to claim. I must consider, not only for myself, but for the life that your choice will demand of me." He inclined his head, understanding more in her hesitation than most would in words of promise. "I would not ask otherwise. Take all the time you require, Miss Whitcombe. Yet know this, my patience, though tested by custom and expectation, is not without limit. I cannot retract what I have declared, but I will honor your deliberation. Whatever your decision, it will be met with respect." Eleanor stood, moving toward the open windows where the last light of afternoon filtered through, painting the marble floor in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. She felt the significance of the moment weigh upon her, a crossroads where humility met courage, where past scars confronted present desire, where whispered truths became the threshold for life-altering choice. She turned slightly, her gaze meeting the Duke's once more. "Then you ask for my hand not in deference to society, nor in spectacle, nor in pity. You ask for it in truth." His lips curved in the barest hint of a smile. "In truth," he confirmed, "and nothing less will ever satisfy me." Eleanor inhaled the faint fragrance of citrus and polished wood, her pulse steadying as clarity took hold. The conservatory, the fountains, the filtered light, they all seemed to shrink away, leaving only the gravity of the man before her, and the freedom of the choice she had yet to make. As she stepped back toward the door, the last word of their encounter remained unspoken but felt inescapable. The future would demand courage, decisiveness, and a willingness to face the judgment of a world that had never expected her to rise. And in that quiet anticipation, Eleanor felt both fear and exhilaration, a trembling knowledge that the life she had known was ending, and a life of her own choosing was waiting just beyond the threshold. The conservatory doors closed behind her with a deliberate echoing click, leaving only the soft ripple of fountains and a lingering sense that nothing in London, or in her heart, would ever be quite the same. The final evening of the season arrived like a slow tide, carrying with it the weight of anticipation, whispers, and expectations long nurtured by society's most discerning eyes. Lady Harbury's ballroom had never appeared grander, though Eleanor Whitcombe now saw it with new clarity. Candles blazed in crystal candelabras, reflecting against mirrors that multiplied the shimmer of gowns and jewelry 100-fold. Music drifted from the orchestra, yet it seemed to her now less important than the unspoken rhythms of observation, speculation, and desire that pulsed beneath the polished floorboards. Eleanor entered with her mother at her side, her posture impeccably straight, her eyes calm and deliberate. No tremor disturbed her composure, yet beneath the surface, a careful awareness hummed through every step. The whispers followed her as always, though now they carried a different tone, a mixture of curiosity, envy, and reluctant admiration. Those who had mocked her only weeks before now struggled to disguise their astonishment at the quiet authority she carried. She had learned, over months of scrutiny and whispered commentary, that presence alone could silence judgment far more effectively than any defense or explanation. She did not immediately search for him among the assembled nobility. She knew where he would stand. The Duke of Ravenshire remained as ever composed, yet the certainty of his attention radiated in subtle ways, the inclination of his shoulders, the measured calm of his eyes, the deliberate absence of any other companion near his side. When their eyes met across the ballroom, she felt the familiar, invisible tether pull taut. He approached her with his customary deliberation, not hastened by desire or impatience, but measured by the confidence that had always unsettled those who failed to understand him. "Miss Whitcombe," he said, voice low yet clear enough to carry over the faint strains of violins, "the room grows impatient, though none are as they appear." "Nor are we," she replied, her lips curving in the faintest acknowledgment of his observation. "I have learned that patience may be more revealing than rush." A hush followed him as he moved closer, drawing subtle attention without spectacle. Whispers circled in his wake, but Eleanor paid them no mind. She was no longer the girl who had endured ridicule in silence. She was deliberate, poised, and fully aware of the power carried by the composure she now wielded with quiet mastery. They stood together near the center of the ballroom, where light from the chandeliers pooled like liquid gold. Eleanor observed the faces turned toward them. Women whose smiles no longer held mockery, men whose curiosity could not mask genuine astonishment. Yet still, she said nothing, waited, allowing the tension to gather in measured increments. The world might have demanded explanation, but she would not be compelled to offer it. Not yet. At last, the Duke inclined his head slightly, so subtle that many of the onlookers missed the motion entirely, but Eleanor understood its significance. He knelt, not in theatrics, not for show, but in deliberate action that spoke of humility and intention combined. "Miss Whitcombe," he said, his voice low yet resonant, carrying through the space as if the walls themselves were lending witness, "I ask not for ceremony, nor for approval, nor for pity. I ask for your hand, freely given, in a union that shall know neither doubt nor pretense. Will you consent to be my Countess?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Candles flickered in response to the sudden stillness. Music faltered, then returned as if uncertain whether its purpose had changed. Eleanor's pulse quickened, yet her face betrayed nothing. She weighed the gravity of the moment, the history that had brought her here, the courage required not for herself alone, but for the life that would follow this single defining choice. She looked around the ballroom once more, absorbing the expressions of all who had once judged her harshly. There was awe now where once there had been scorn. There was attention where once there had been indifference. And yet none of that mattered. The truth of the Duke's declaration, the sincerity in his eyes, and the years of quiet observation, remembrance, and care demanded her focus alone. "I have lived," she said finally, her voice steady and commanding, "under the scrutiny of a world eager to define me by its own measure. I have learned patience, I have endured humiliation, and I have cultivated dignity where none was expected. Your Grace, I will not refuse what I recognize as genuine. Yes, I will be your Countess." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Candles flickered, and even the musicians paused as though awaiting the next moment. For a heartbeat, the room was suspended in recognition, and then the Duke rose, offering his hand, his eyes alight with quiet triumph and the relief of unspoken burdens finally shared. Eleanor placed her hand in his, not in deference but in partnership, and together they faced the gathered assembly as equals, poised, resolute, and undeniable. The Duchess of Lavenham, who had once whispered about Eleanor's plainness, with careless laughter, now inclined her head with reluctant acknowledgment. Gentlemen who had dismissed her presence now offered respectful bows. The room had shifted, though subtly, and Eleanor knew it. Dignity, courage, and steadfast character could command respect even where beauty had failed to captivate. Later, when the last guests had departed and the chandeliers were extinguished save for a few low-burning candles, Eleanor and the Duke walked together along the terrace overlooking the snow-flecked gardens of Ravenshire House. Silence enveloped them, comfortable and complete, punctuated only by the distant rustle of winter trees and the soft crackle of a hearth fire carried through open windows. He spoke then, softly, deliberately, as though testing the bounds of this new intimacy. "They called you ugly once," he said, eyes fixed upon the distant horizon. Eleanor lifted her face toward him, her lips curving into a calm smile. "Yes," she said, "but you called me yours." For the first time, the weight of every whispered judgment, every slighted glance, every night spent in quiet doubt, fell away. London's scorn could not touch what had been earned through steadfast courage and the deliberate recognition of character. They had weathered the world's cruelty, navigated its subtleties, and emerged bound not by expectation, but by truth and choice. The snow began to fall, slow and deliberate, frosting the dark garden paths in quiet silver, as though even winter paused to witness this union. Eleanor and the Duke remained on the terrace, hands intertwined, each understanding that the world might continue to speculate, judge, or gossip, yet none could undermine the foundation of trust, recognition, and affection they had forged. In that moment, the girl who had once been whispered about and ridiculed became a woman whose presence redefined the very measure of worth in the eyes of all who had once scorned her. And as candlelight danced upon the windows behind them, Eleanor realized that the future, though uncertain, challenging, and uncharted, was hers to face with courage, dignity, and the steady certainty of a love hard-won, deliberate, and undeniable. The conservatory doors and ballroom walls faded into memory, leaving only the crisp air of winter, the soft fall of snow, and the enduring truth that she, Eleanor Whitcombe, was no longer the girl who had endured whispers. She was the Countess of Ravenshire, fully seen, fully recognized, and fully claimed, not by pity nor by spectacle, but by the deliberate devotion of a man who had waited decades to recognize the value the world had overlooked. And so, standing beside the Duke, beneath the quiet shimmer of snow and candlelight, Eleanor felt a freedom that the ballroom had never offered. A certainty that beauty, judgment, and expectation were irrelevant to the truth of the heart, and that a life claimed in honesty could never be diminished, no matter the world's insistence to the contrary.